They've always told me I was horse crazy since I was a child. I never owned one, obviously, as a 3 or 4 year old kid. So I would pull all of the paper out of the trash can to draw horses. I just drew horses all day. So I think Dad got horses when I was in 8th grade, and he didn't know what he was doing, and my sister and I did not know what we were doing. We just kind of got on these 2 old horses and putted around. I'm sure our equitation looked really bad, but I fall a couple times and you learn as you go. My dad lived up in South Dakota at the time, and we would even go out there in the 3-foot snow to ride the horses every day. My sophomore year in high school, that my sister, Hannah, kind of out of the blue randomly emailed Pinnacle Stables, and she shot an email to Holly saying, we'd be totally willing to clean stalls or clean tack or do whatever it is we could do so we could trade our work time for ride time. Of course, I wanted to come along too. Who wouldn't? But we volunteered out at the barn for a whole year and a half, and we learned a lot more, rode lots of different horses. Anyone who needed trail miles on him. The barn owner, Jason, would just throw us up there and we got to ride. But we learned any and everything there is to know about horse care out at Pinnacle. The first time I ever met Cash, I hated him. He was literally the worst horse we had on the whole property. He would break out of the pasture and let everyone else out. So I constantly was having to go on roundups because of this one right here. But there got to be a point in Pinnacle's history in which we didn't have that many trail riding horses available, and Cash was in the training rotation twice a week, so I had to ride him. And he was awful. He was as terrible in the saddle as he was on the ground. He was stubborn, he didn't want to move. You literally had to either carry a whip or a stick around with you to whoop him with to get him to go anywhere. And he had this irritating habit of bucking if you could get him to run. But I had to keep riding him, so I did. And it took me a long time to realize that mules are a little different than horses. A mule knows exactly what you want of him, but convincing him that it's a good idea is the hard part. Usually a horse will just do as you ask, but with a mule, they either have to trust you or think that your idea is a good idea. But after a while, I started to realize that Cash actually knew the trails better than any horse on the property. A mule's eyes are oriented on his head differently, so he can actually see all 4 feet at once. Not like a horse, they can only see their front feet. He's very sure-footed, and I didn't have to micromanage him on the trails like I did with the other horses. He would autopilot the path, he knew where to go, and I didn't have to think about anything. Cash could just kind of navigate the trails for me. I think it took about a year to get to that point. I realized that I had seen more of Pinnacle's property on the back of a mule than any other horse. Yeah. I remember the first winter that I taught tricks to Cash. It was during hunting season, so we weren't allowed to ride on the trails, and he and I were both bored. And there was another girl who had taught her horse to smile, and I thought it was just the cutest thing ever, so I thought I would teach Cash how to smile. And the way I started off was I would give him a handful of grain just to get him interested, and then I would kind of touch his mouth or touch his lip, and then I'd give him more grain, and I would say, smile, smile, and I would kind of get that word connected with the action I was wanting to do in mind. Eventually I would only give him grain if he did any kind of mouth movement, anything. I'd give him grain for any sort of effort, but eventually, I would start making him give more and more effort before I would finally give him the handful. And he definitely understands the difference between a small handful and a big handful of grain. he knows he did well if I give him a big handful as opposed to a small one. But I think it took about 2 months before we perfected Smile, and at that point he had learned how to learn, so each successive trick after that became easier. I think the next one I taught him was how to shake, and then I taught him how to stand on the mounted jack, which is not really what horses do, but I taught him how to do it anyway. But yes, it seems like every new trick we learn from here on out just comes faster and faster for him. I think we know 12 or 13 tricks at this point. In Catch's case, the trick training was also really good mental stimulation for him. Mules have plenty of extra intelligence to spare, and they will, if they're bored, they'll spend it breaking out of the fence or getting in trouble. I noticed that after we started trick training and working his brain more, he calmed down in a lot of ways. He was a little more willing to listen while we were trail riding, and he didn't spend as much time trying to break out of fences anymore. One thing that really gets on my nerves is lazy horse owners. These are people that you see walk out into the field, and instead of walking out to find their horse, they bring a bucket of grain with them and shake it. Of course, every horse in the field wants some grain, so they all come galloping down to the fence in a big crowd, and they're pushing and biting at each other. And then the owner will pull her horse out of the field, set that grain bucket aside, and pretend like she never had it. So the horse comes expecting a reward, and then never gets the reward. My intuition tells me to use a different set of learning behaviors. Instead, I will walk out into the field and use my body language to communicate with the horse. This approach is more powerful because my body is something that's always readily available. There might be an instance in which you don't have food to get to the horse. There are 4 types of operant conditioning. The owner, who goes out to the field and shakes her bucket of grain, is using negative reinforcement. She is negatively taking away that food reward. And then lastly, I use positive reinforcement. When the horse moves towards me, I can verbally praise him. That is applying a reward. To explain it a little easier in people terms, a positive punishment would be if you spanked your kid. A positive reinforcement would be giving the kid a cookie when they do something you want them to do. A negative reinforcement would be if you grounded your child because they did something you didn't want them to do. And then negative punishment would be, say, ignoring your child if he won't stop bugging you. There are also many learning methods. Not all horses think the same. Dr. Kami Hileski is a PhD in animal science who has an emphasis in equine behavior and welfare. She explains several ways in which horses learn. The most common are signal learning, which is similar to what Pavlov did with his dogs. They responded biologically to that bell he was sounding. And then there's operant learning. This is, for example, Skinner's rat pulling a lever to obtain food. Veterinarian Robert Foster places a high value on using behavior modification techniques to reduce stress and risk in the veterinarian's office. Reducing behavior problems reduces the risk of injury to both her staff and the horse, so choosing the correct, most efficient, and long-term solution is vital. While many people believe that a horse misbehaves out of spite or anger, Foster believes that behavior problems arise solely from fear and anxiety. Traditional horsemanship relies upon negative reinforcement for training. An untrained horse learning under saddle will eventually discover through trial and error how to respond with an operant behavior. When the trainer applies leg pressure, which is a stimulus, the trainer will continue to increase that pressure until the horse walks forward, and then they remove the pressure. While this method is not harmful to the animal, modern, science-based horse trainers like Madison Shambaugh are becoming increasingly aware that the most effective way to train is through positive reinforcement. Shambaugh utilizes clicker training for her work with both horses and dolphins. Beginning with food as a reward, she eventually phases that out for the sound of the clicker. She goes beyond that and even phases the clicker out for a body language cue or a spoken praise. Animals who are trained in this way are excited to work. They expend much more effort to achieve the reward than they would if they were moving away from pressure. Concerning food reward, Shambaugh even says, "You can accidentally apply negative punishment to the horse by ending the session abruptly."
So with positive reinforcement, it's really important that I'm going to end the session kind of in a special way, because I don't want this to end up as punishment, okay? Meaning negative punishment, meaning I'm taking away something like her favorite toy.
I have come to the same conclusion when teaching my mule Cash. Horses are lazy creatures, and mules are even more so. A horse will exert the lowest possible effort to remove an unpleasant stimulus. However, horses are highly food motivated, so a horse will continually persist to solve a task and even become more creative to receive a reward. Good. So the reason that positive reinforcement is so important is because it really gets your horse to think in a new way. It gets them to problem solve, and it gets them to want to figure out what it is you're asking of them. Whereas with traditional horsemanship, you ride your horse, you ask him to do things, and in order to get you to stop pulling on his mouth or kicking him, he will move. But in the case of positive reinforcement, the horse is looking for a reason to get a reward, and eventually it becomes sort of a game to him. Your horse thinks it's fun. So it really helps your horse to not think about how he can avoid doing work, but to get excited for his work.
Maybe we pick the spot that has too nice grass.